This is sheer lunacy. This is just absolute lunacy. We've reached a pathological extreme. Right now, we're dealing with pervasive pathology in our younger generation. We're seeing anxiety conditions that we've not seen before. We've seen a propensity towards suicide that we've never seen before. We're still living in this illusion that we've made the choice to be this way. No.
Who are you?
I'm a physicist, and then I had the opportunity to get into this field of neurofeedback. I experienced the war, so I've spent essentially the rest of my life in pursuit of that obligation to repair the world. The whole issue of quantum entanglement, we have to take it seriously. If we just show the brain its dance, now we're putting the brain in front. The brain is in charge of its own recovery. We're now living very much under the constraints of a left brain consciousness. We may be seeing just the existing structure failing. In a modern world, the mother really cannot devote herself to the infant. Child abuse is one thing. Neglect is equally devastating.
Does the kid have behavioral issues, or does our society have issues with normal behavior?
We're not in a child-friendly status. This has to change. We can't solve the problems just with neurofeedback, as wonderful as it is.
Welcome to today's episode of Getting to Know You. I'm your host, Cameron Edward Benton, and on today's episode, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Siegfried Othmer. Dr. Othmer is a trained physicist out of Cornell University who became a pioneer in the world of neurofeedback, where he coined the Othmer method alongside his late wife, Susan Othmer, a trained neuroscientist. Starting with the recovery of their own son, Brian, who was dealing with epilepsy and other mood issues, they were able to find this cool technique called neurofeedback, which allowed them to train their own brain waves in unique ways that allowed the brain to heal itself. Now it's used regularly for the treatment of ADHD, PTSD, epilepsy, and several other disorders. In this episode, we talk with Dr. Othmer about his journey through neurofeedback, the discoveries of those things, and how it changed his life and the rest of the world, as well as the deep mysteries of physics, of mental health, of quantum mechanics, even touching into things of trauma and telepathy. One of the things I hope that you really get out of this episode is if you pay attention to Dr. Othmer's deep combination of curiosity, tenacity, and deep scientific rigor, balanced with the gentle, compassionate, curious soul who is deeply interested in the mysteries of the universe and doing his absolute best to solve them and help heal the world. Without further ado, here is Getting to Know Dr. Siegfried Othmer. Who are you?
Oh my goodness. All right. Professionally, I'm a physicist, and I am my professional self is a big part of myself. It's perhaps, my German background, born in Germany and during the war years, 1940. And what happened to my generation is they were just burdened with profound guilt about what had happened in Germany. As soon as they became conscious of what had actually happened. And of course, I experienced the war, so it came naturally to me. And that burden meant that you were obligated to repair, right? And so I've spent essentially the rest of my life in in pursuit of that obligation to repair the world. And I ended up in aerospace, and whereas it was good science and really challenging at the scientific level, I also always realized, wait a minute, this is ultimately in the interest of war fighting. What am I doing here? This is not really how I want to spend my life. And then I had the opportunity to get into this field of neurofeedback, which then fulfilled that essential obligation to make a positive contribution to the world.
Beautiful. Yeah, I really felt that as you spoke, that just how prevalent the war seemingly was and is for you, and how resonant that was for you in creating a very meaningful life purpose from that point on. Why did you, I guess, for the audience's sake, we should give a little bit of background about
what you do, but maybe we can talk about that. Is like, why did you end up shifting into a field that was very much focused on mental health of all things?
Well, that was simply a circumstance in my life. It was not a decision that I made as such. It just emerged, and the origin story here is that our firstborn son was behaviorally troubled from quite early on. He was kind of a mystery to us, and a mystery to everybody else also. So he was a mystery to people in preschool and so forth. And then what happened was the behavior really started going south, age 7, 8, and so forth, and eventuated in violent behavior. And of course, in those days, and this was the 70s, there was no understanding of any of that. You know, this was a parenting issue. Basically, this was our problem. The whole world looked at us as a failure in parenting. But these violent episodes were just out of the blue, totally unpredictable, and very uncharacteristic of the child we knew him, our son, to be. And the other thing is that he was profoundly remorseful afterwards. Now, in the event, while he's fighting with somebody, it looked intentional as any boxer in the ring, right? It couldn't look otherwise. But afterwards, we realized, wait a minute, this was not intentional behavior. This was neurologically driven behavior. Now, imagine this. This child gets expelled from school at the age of 8. When does this happen? How does this happen?
Yeah.
And you get to take him home. The school says we never want to see him again. And fortunately, at that moment, the pediatrician realized the possibility of a neurological involvement. And that allowed us to go beyond the parenting model. It says, okay, there's something real going on here, just like we suspected. Now we had a frame in which to reconsider the situation of our son. And so he was placed on anticonvulsants, and eventually we found the right one and the right dose and so forth. And that kind of contained the violent behavior, but the behavior problems continued. He was still this oddball who couldn't relate to people, verbally ungainly, intellectual, very verbal parents, and then there's this. Uh, so
Can I ask just real quickly with that, when you're having this, your son, and going through this, and you mentioned like this responsibility as a parent that you really feel, and from societally, right, that you're kind of failing as a parent because your child is behaving this way during this time, and you also have this societal obligation that you said because of World War II. Like how are you processing all of that at that time? Were you just kind of going through a lot of guilt with the way that your son was behaving? Like, how did you end up managing your own stuff through all that?
yeah, no, it was a parenting challenge beyond belief, uh, because the situation was just unsustainable. I mean,
Yeah.
you couldn't take this kid anywhere. I mean, there were events that were just absolutely hair raising, and we'd go to Sierra Club outings, and we had to be watched like a hawk because something untoward might happen, and this had us on pins and needles. No, it was an enormous parenting challenge, but of course you had no choice. Nobody else is going to come to the rescue. Um, yeah, and this went on for 9 years, right? I mean, life was hell. Now we got him into a Waldorf school, which I think was the ideal placement for him, and they took him. They took this, uh, And they allowed him to be who he was, which is the virtue of a Waldorf school. He would climb the trees, the eucalyptus trees in the yard, and he was allowed to do that. He was competent to do it, and uh, and so
So can
that
I
kind,
pause
yeah,
then? Sorry, not to just keep interrupting, but it's partly my job to interrupt. So
yeah.
when when you say like he has like behavioral issues, but then they put him in a school and he could be who he was, like when you see something like that, do you like what comes up for me is like wondering, okay, well, does the kid have behavioral issues or does our society have issues with like normal behavior or human behavior in a certain way? Or like how do you kind of parse those two things? Because you can put him in one school and he's not thriving, you put him in another environment and he is thriving. Or it seems like he's thriving, at least from your story. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is really a credit to the environment that was created at the Waldorf School, that he was not triggered. And not only that, it was a context where you go through the grades with the same kids all the way through high school, and so everybody kind of knows who he is and knows how to deal with it, right? So there are no surprises for anybody around. He's in this comfortable environment that he's now been in for a number of years, and so that was a very protective situation. And yes, indeed, somehow these adverse events must have been triggered. But often sometimes his encounters were with pure strangers where there was no prior context, right? So the violent events did seem to be really just well. Let me just say it. We regarded them as subclinical seizure events, right? That
Wow.
the brain just went into another mode because of what later came to be identified as temporal lobe epilepsy.
Hmm.
But when we first went to a neurologist, having been persuaded now of the neurological model because the anticonvulsants were working, and then we were crestfallen when the neurologist wouldn't hear of it. He said, "No, no, this is the parenting problem." Oh no, we have started ground zero. Now we have to educate this guy. And I'm thinking, you take him home, right? That'll cure you of that model very quickly. Uh, and then, of course, what happens? You see this bizarre behavior. I said, wait a minute, this is not normal human behavior. Something's going on here. But these neurologists they're living in a sort of disconnected universe. And to this day, neurologists are sort of not connected to the real world, and and they're beginning to realize it.
What do you when you say
Fortunately,
they're not connected to the real world? Like, what do you mean by that?
well, exactly that.
Hmm.
It is the field of medicine is in this very narrowly defined part of the universe where what you're entitled to believe is very limited and desiccated and packaged and formal, and anything outside of that they're supposed to be skeptical of, right? And
Hmm.
particularly skeptical of the parent walking in lecturing you about their child. Says, no, 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 I'm the authority here,
Hmm.
And we started using the word seizure. No, no, you don't get the. I'm the one who gets to use the word seizure, And he
Hmm.
kept shutting us down, shutting down the conversation. He was a famous neurologist, John Menkes, and ultimately he
Hmm.
came around. But it was a very frustrating encounter, and then it got to the point where we were ready to titrate the medications back down. Okay, this is the next part of the story when Brian started getting neurofeedback, and his behavior improved, and he didn't need those heavy duty meds anymore. So we and now the pediatrician was hesitant. He says, "Nah, he didn't know, but he didn't really trust the neurofeedback." So he said, "Well, no, I want a neurologist to give me the okay that we can decrease the meds." And turns out there was a neurologist in the same medical building. So we, made an appointment, got a brain scan and whatever. And the neurologist then pronounced that, well, this child doesn't have temporal lobe epilepsy, and he never did. right? And uh, and now I'm about to argue with him. I said, wait a minute, and I said, shut
Hmm.
up, Siegfried. You got what you wanted, you know.
Yeah. Well, so why do you think that is? Like, why do you feel like, or why do you think that like this man, in particular, I don't want to necessarily project on everyone, but like a lot of people within certain industries when they have a lot of knowledge like this, like why do you think he was so tightly, I don't know, held to his beliefs that he couldn't see something sort of outside, or was so stubbornly resisting something like that?
Well, no, this is characteristic of medicine.
Hmm.
You need to think of medicine as basically the military model, right?
Hmm.
Or you can take the model of the Catholic Church. The priests don't get to make theology. You know, they get to
Hmm.
preach the theology, but they don't make it. So you you can have your private opinions as a priest, but when you are performing your priestly roles, you got to stick with the formal doctrine,
Hmm.
and so I think there's the theological model, and then there's the military model. That MDs are really not allowed to stray in terms of what they say and how they practice, um, and this regimentation, is just inculcated into them through the whole entire medical curriculum. And there's an analogy here actually to my experience in physics, and that is in my entire physics career, we never encountered the mysteries. We were only taught about what is in fact established knowledge, right? Well, there are a lot of mysteries surrounding quantum mechanics, but you never got to delve into them. Uh, and the dictum there was shut up and calculate. In other words, if the experiment comes out according to the quantum mechanical model, then you're done. You don't ask questions about the craziness of quantum mechanics, right? And likewise, the MD doesn't get to ask about the mysteries, all those things we don't understand. The only words that come out of his mouth are the things that are authorized, and everything else is just, and that's why all non-medical modalities can't be talked about by the MD, right? You go to an MD, you get a medical remedy, regardless of what it is, because that is simply the burden on them. They can't leave the reservation.
Yeah, it's like their orthodoxy in a sense,
It's
right?
an
Like it's
orthodoxy.
funny.
Yeah, an
Yeah,
enforced
I mean, it's
orthodoxy. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
and it's so fascinating with the way you're describing it with like being able to tune into the mysteries. 'Cause it does make me think of I've been doing a lot of deep diving onto religion and religious history and different religions, and like I recently went into a Greek Orthodox church for the first time, and I was raised Protestant, and they actually have a very um, I would say a healthy relationship with mystery. They actually deeply embrace mystery as sort of the ethos or part of what they do, and like kind of being able to like lean into that and celebrate the mysteries of various things that don't make sense. They really embrace paradox, and even in different religious organizations and traditions, there's kind of this step ladder function that's very similar to what you're talking about, where it's like here are like the religious rules, and then like as you get deeper, then there's like the mystery version of this religion on sort of these deeper levels or annals. And almost even when you're talking about physics, right? It's like you're talking about, oh, here's all the things that you do, but then there's like, oh, but then there's this mystery, there's this like spiritual emptiness, this paradox that doesn't make sense. Like, I'm just curious, like, what you make of all that, because that's really fascinating. I've never heard anybody express it like that before.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you see, being in physics, the outside world thinks, okay, that's where things become real, right? That's where we understand the things to the nth decimal point, and we do understand the ionization potential of helium to the nth decimal point. Yes, it's really amazing, but there are the mysteries, and they are very humbling. They're very humbling, and of course, you're constantly confronted with them, but not in your education. That comes in your other reading, and it was never in the classroom. And that's, I think it's directly analogous to what happens in medical education. You know, the things that are left ambiguous in the field of medicine just don't get addressed. The complicated issues like pain and so forth, they don't get a pain education in medicine because it's one of the mysteries.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious about that with you, yeah, because you mentioned like mysteries in physics, mysteries in medicine. Like, what are some of those mysteries that stand out to you in physics and within medicine that you wish got more attention?
Uh, well, the essential mystery in in physics is of course the whole issue of quantum entanglement. But within the last 20 years, the essential experiments have been done that uh, that means we have to take it seriously. We can't compartmentalize it away and say and discount it. No, it's not our life through quantum computing and all of that. But
And for the audience and for my own sake, well, what is quantum entanglement as far as you understand it?
uh, that multiple particles can live in a quantum mechanical state that persists over time with integrity, maintaining its essential character over an extended period of time. And now you see where this touches the real world is that the other conundrum is how does science deal with mental telepathy? And that is they don't talk about it, right? Because it's one of the mysteries. Now you can't make it go away. It's very clearly happens, and so we need to try to explain it. But now you see we actually have a model. Quantum entanglement gives us a model to explain mental telepathy. That in fact our brains at a distance may still be in communication. So
Could
and
you
yeah, go ahead.
could you say more about that? Because one of the statements you said was um, it clearly happens. So you're saying mental telepathy clearly happens. And then you're saying the model of entanglement creates a model that allows us to explain it. Can you connect those two dots for me? Like when you say that it clearly happens, what do you mean by that? And then how does quantum entanglement allow us to see a model for this?
Yeah. Uh, so it clearly happens. During the Iraq War, there were mothers in particular who, in the middle of the night, realized that had this strong sense that their son was wounded in Iraq, and then that turned out to be true. So, and there are lots of events like that that are, you know, quite numerous and can't be explained away. So there was this connection. We see this intimate connection often between identical twins, and they're aware of each other's emotions and so forth, even when they're apart. And particularly when things rise to the level of a crisis, then it can intrude into the consciousness of the person that you are bonded with. And what is that bond? That bond is quantum mechanical, right? It's quantum entanglement and in fact, that was almost surely critically involved in the whole issue of consciousness, the heart problem. That this is a quantum mechanical phenomenon, and our consciousness can be you know in long-term communication with another consciousness. We're not necessarily aware of that until maybe the crisis occurs. So it turns out, and this is the connection now with our field. The original discovery of the EEG by Hans Berger was in consequence of a of such an event, and this really nails it. So he was in the military in Prussia, and was actually severely wounded as a gun carriage nearly ran over him. The horses were spooked, and so anyway, so he thought his end had come. He thought he was going to die. Well, it turns out he was only lightly wounded, as it turns out. But he was afraid that that he would die. And that afternoon, he got a telegram from his father asking, how's he doing? Well, that came out of the blue. What had happened was that his sister, who was miles away, many miles away, realized that something had happened to her brother, and communicated with her father. Says, you need to get in touch with the military. I fear that your son has been gravely injured. And so there's a timestamp here. There's a telegram there, right? And you can cite other cases like that. So this is quite clearly a reality, right? And it's a reality that science simply didn't know how to deal with. But now we can talk about it, because now we can make science out of it by talking about quantum entanglement.
Yeah. Well,
And
I would love that. Like so because what I'm hearing in that is that what you're saying is that there's all this phenomena that we've seen over time. And I don't even know if you're familiar. Are you familiar with the telepathy tapes? Have you heard of that recently?
yeah.
Yeah.
Again,
So
that's again quantum entanglement, right?
right. Well, so we see, like, I think to your point, right? There's at least a collection of data of reported phenomena that seems to be coherent and unexplainable in a way that we don't understand, but is clearly repeatable and happens over and over again.
Right.
And what I'm hearing, and I've never heard this before, is that quantum entanglement can explain it. And it sounds like what you're saying, particularly with it, is that it's that the fact that there is essentially that sustained particles or pieces of us, our consciousness or our whatever and whoever we are, maybe physical parts of our body even, are interconnected with each other that remain stable, and that allows this sort of other form of communication that's sort of beyond our current understanding, in a sense.
Uh, yes. So the thing is, with quantum entanglement, it is to a certain extent, with these quantum mechanical phenomena and so forth, just a little bit, uh, untouchable. It's a little bit beyond us. It's beyond me anyway. So yes, we have a model, and and that makes we don't feel silly talking about mental telepathy and so forth. But the essential mystery will remain. I mean, quantum entanglement typically requires very specific conditions in which the system is preserved from external perturbations, external inputs, which means we take them to low temperature and so forth. And so these quantum computers are at low temperature, but not the human brain. So how does quantum entanglement even happen, in the human brain? And it may be a matter of scale that it only sustains itself uh, with sufficient scale. But now I'm talking beyond my pay grade.
No, it's okay though. I appreciate the insight and your perspective. I think, like I said, that there's always things that are outside of our depth of understanding, or where we can go, our pay grade, as you would say. But I also, appreciate the fact that you are a physicist, right? You're somebody who deeply studied this stuff in a way that most people will never even touch, right? And so to hear you talk about some of these things and concepts and possibilities that come from them, I think are fascinating. Although I do think right now it would be probably a great pace to pivot into where your pay grade and high expertise is, which is neurofeedback, neuroscience, and what has been coined as the Othmer method. So I wonder, like, even in your own journey, how did you get from being a physicist to the Othmer method and neurofeedback?
Yeah. So at one point, 1985, my wife gets a call from a colleague from college, from Cornell, and said, "I just heard this remarkable lecture, and I think this would be of interest to you. It's at the Learning Disability Association." And this lady talked about neurofeedback. So Sue calls up the lady that happens to be living 6 miles away from our house in Beverly Hills. Okay, Sue talks to her for an hour, and she says, "Well, I'm coming." Well, Mrs. Othmer, would you like to know what it costs? Well, yes, I'd like to know what it costs, but I'm coming. We were going to do this. Sue's background was neuroscience. She actually studied physics at Cornell, and that's where we met. When she was a freshman, I was a graduate student, so we met. I was impressed. She was the only female in a huge class, and I said, "How bold, right?" And turns out that her mother had studied physics at Oxford, so this was actually second generation. But then her intention was always to go into neurobiology, which was a new field at that time. Harvard didn't start its neurophysiology department until 1966, which is the year that Sue entered her graduate study in that field at Cornell, which already had a neurobiology department. Under an interesting guy, Frank Rosenblatt, who is now looked at as the father of AI, because he essentially started the field of neural networks, and his perceptron is at the Smithsonian right now. So anyway, she was headed for an interesting career. The problem is that Frank Rosenblatt died in a sailing accident tragically a couple of years later. By that time, Sue and I are in Los Angeles. I, to assume make some money, and so I was in aerospace. And Sue was doing finishing her PhD work at the UCLA Brain Research Institute under its director, Ross Adey. And so, this is academia as it was back then, not particularly friendly to female graduate students, particularly not in neurosciences. Sue actually did get an NIH grant, which was quite unusual for her as a female. And anyway, that aborted her career, PhD career. UCLA wouldn't accept a transfer of Cornell credits, and so anyway. And Sue said at the time, I can do anything in my life in science that I want to do, provided I don't insist on getting the credit, right? If I just I can play second fiddle anywhere, and she says, I don't need the credit. I just want to do the work. But then that opportunity was foreclosed. Now, 20 years later, nearly 20 years later, we're in the door here with his practitioner, and Brian responds to the training. And Sue says, okay, I have to try it. And she responds to the training, single session effects. I respond to the training in 4 sessions.
And just for the sake of the audience, when you're saying response to the training, can you express what is the training at this point? What is it people are responding to? If assuming somebody's never heard of neurofeedback or that kind of thing, what is it that you're experiencing at this point?
Yeah, so you're sitting there essentially looking at aspects of your EEG, and nobody can explain this to you. You just sit there and do it.
Yeah. And the EEG, again, just for the audience.
Okay, that's your brainwave activity, the neuronal dance, right?
Yeah.
And extracting certain pieces of information out of it that you're then watching the time course unfold. And the thing is, it's a mystery to you, but it's not a mystery to the brain. The brain says, "Thank you, that's my dance," right? And so the brain is happily, because the brain is happy, you're content, right? You put up with it. Again, the brain rules. So if the brain is happy, you just sit there and take it. You may be a little bored, but the brain says, "Thank you." And so what happened is that Sue had a single session effect. So I came home from work, and Sue says, "There's a new person in the house." And I go in the living room looking for our visitor, and then I go back in the kitchen, and she's grinning ear to ear. So no, I'm talking about myself here. And then our son, changed also. But of course, we were the skeptical parents at that point. This is, we need to really be convinced. And of course, by that time, we had tried all sorts of therapies that essentially were not effective. And so we'd had our fingers burned. And so we were, we were not pushovers for this. We were skeptical professionals. And so it was 1 month in when somebody said, they knew Brian, and he said, Brian is easier. Are you guys doing anything? Aha, independent validation, right? So that loosened our tongue. And then soon I started sharing our observations, and we had made the same observations. And okay, and well, that was just the beginning. And I did about 4 sessions. And I said, okay, that's fine, and I didn't have any particular problems, except that I also had suffered a minor head injury some years before in a school outing with Brian and his class. And these were actually rather devastating to my professional career as a scientist in aerospace, because episodically I would have a day or two of vertigo, which kept me from work. Not good. And I also had episodes of memory dropout. As I'm talking here, I can, of course, all of us can recall what we have just said. But I would have these very rare, but it did happen, episodes where suddenly I would not remember what I just said. And this is not good in a professional, scientific environment. And so, and I would then, not knowing what I've just said, I would then have to repeat my thought because what I intended to say was still there. But that must have looked strange to my colleagues, like what's happening to Siegfried. So, and it took a while for me to realize that with those 4 sessions that I did, all that disappeared. It just never happened again. It says, oh, I actually benefited too. Until then, I didn't think anything had really happened. But when I realized those things that were recurring, every once in a while, episodically, were no longer happening, I said, I have to take this very seriously. Brian was benefiting. Our younger son, Kurt, who now runs our business, benefited in terms of his hyperactivity. And so, every member of our family had benefited. I says, okay. And not only that, but my wife, who, of course, was seeing this with scientific eyes because of her background in neurobiology. She was sitting there watching the comings and goings as Brian was being trained. People sitting in the waiting room discussing their cases. And it turns out that the clinician was sitting in the waiting room also. And just, they're all just chatting, right? Because the person didn't need to be attended to. It's a single protocol, person's in the other room just training away. And so Sue was amazed at what was happening. This person was working on traumatic brain injury. Talk about what medicine ignores. Medicine totally ignored the issue of concussions back then. So there are, of course, lingering effects in a lot of concussions, and nobody was treating them. No one's dealing with them. They didn't have a way of treating them, right? So medicine doesn't talk about the things that it cannot fix. So anyways, we were seeing just remarkable recoveries, and of course this carried over into the discussions at the dinner table, and pretty soon we found ourselves developing an instrument that computerized this mysterious method. I recruited an aerospace engineer. He labored for 3 years without pay to do this because he had experienced what was happening to Brian. It was just riveting to everybody who knew him, and we realized this is going to change the world, right? But the world just wasn't ready. What we didn't count on, because this does not happen in physics. In physics, people are humble, and nature catches up with you. If you try to fool Mother Nature by messing with your papers and shaping the data to your no. It'll catch up with you. So research fraud, you don't see that in physics. We're all just working. There's no point. And why? Uh, you know, and this is the difference with medicine, right? In medicine, there's always an objective. It's always goal oriented, and you kind of, if there's a chance to nudge the data in your favor a little bit, there's this huge temptation, but no, doesn't happen, and doesn't happen in physics. And uh, okay, now I'm off track, but
No, you're good. I'll get you back on track. So like where I want to go with that part is you were talking about, you're seeing these great results with your son. It's kind of like almost blowing everyone's mind, and you start to develop this new technology. It sounds like along the lines of this, and where I would love for you to kind of fill in the gap with there is like what um, what kind of neurofeedback were you using, and what kinds of things were you seeing that led to like the necessity of a new technology? What was the point of this new technology?
well, we didn't have the right words for it at the time, but we have the right words for it now. And what we call our method is endogenous neuromodulation, because the essence of the breakthrough that clinician had made, and she never really got the credit for it because she didn't want to talk about it. This was her secret. And uh, and I said, she wanted to be famous before she revealed her secret. I said, that's not the way the world works. That's backwards. Margaret, tell the world, teach the world how to do this, and the world will give you credit. Don't keep your secrets. So it turns out that she didn't do that, but so we did it. So basically, we taught her method and also evolved it. And
And
the
what was that method? Like
yeah,
what was it that she was seeing, or what you were seeing? I
well, the
guess
essence
in
of
this
it
case.
is that we just get to watch the EEG, because the EEG is the information, does contain the information that the brain needs in order to improve its own function. That is the essence of the story.
And so
So
when you say watch the EEG, if I'm in neurofeedback, I've got the electrodes on my head. Am I literally watching the EEG as it goes by? I mean, is it the person, or is it the clinicians watching it? We're both watching it. What does that picture look?
well, mainly the
Or am I
client.
going ahead?
Right. The client has to watch it. The clinician, just needs to see that it's a decent signal, good quality signal, and so forth, and reassure themselves that all is well. But then the details escape the clinician. It's another world. When the brain engages with its own signal, it is in its own world, right? It's operating in first of all, the brain operates in virtual reality anyway, right? It has its own universe of neuronal firings, which it uses to make up what we experience. But in its own little universe, it's just neuronal firings, right? And whatever sets the context for that. And uh, and so now we show it the activity, the neuronal firings, and the brain. It's a recognition. The brain, it says, this is me. Not only that, once it knows that's me, it immediately utilizes that information for its benefit. And that is, of course, the way the brain is organized. You can think about that in terms of our motor responses. The way we learn a motor skill is by the brain watching itself perform the skill. Whether it be shooting pool, shooting baskets, playing the violin, learning how to play the piano. All of that, the skill gets built by the brain observing itself performing the skill. And so now when we show, well, what is the brain's essential activity? It is taking care of itself. Everything else is detail, right? 95 to 99% of what the brain does is just take care of itself. You can think of it as just an aircraft carrier. There may be a handful of pilots on the board, but there are 4,000 people on board just keeping the ship going, right? And so the brain is like that. Most of its activity is just keeping the ship going. And now endogenous neuromodulation is that ongoing activity. Nobody's doing anything to it. Now the problem is that neurofeedback entered into our pathological medical world, where we insist on being in charge of what happens, right? The therapist always needs to be in charge. That is obligation, right? And on the MD, the psychotherapist, everything. But here, you see, we're encountering this complex of mysteries. We don't really know the rules. And so when we try to put ourselves in charge of improving brain function, that often doesn't go very well. But if we just show the brain its dance, now we're putting the brain in front, right? The brain is in charge of its own recovery. We're just furnishing the information. Now things can still go wrong, but then that just means, okay, we're dealing with very complicated brains which are highly dysregulated. And so we need to be more delicate in choosing what information to show the brain. But by and large, this is a very self-correcting process. The brain operates in its own wisdom. And its wisdom is, in fact, profound. The fact that the brain recognizes this activity as self is already staggering, right? And that's what makes the whole thing work. So we can think of endogenous neuromodulation in two ways. One is, of course, that is the native activity within the brain. But we use the term endogenous neuromodulation as the process, right? Because we're putting that in a feedback loop, and now the brain is witness to its own activity and gets to alter its native ongoing activity in very subtle ways. And this happens at a level of such subtlety that it could not be outsourced to someone else. We really have to let the brain do this. This is humbling, right? Like physics. You just have to stand back and say, okay, we're at the level of subtlety where we can't, as external observers, decide whether this is better, going this way is better than going that way. It's a little bit like, think of you're driving down the freeway and your hands on the steering wheel, but the fact of the matter is, you're not worrying about the steering wheel. Your brain's got the steering wheel, right? It's taking care of the steering wheel. You've got better things to think about than staying in the lane. So your brain's taking care of that. But the tiny little adjustments in the steering wheel that keep happening are really at a much more subtle level. It's not like the car's being steered wrong, right? It happens at a subtle level that we cannot begin to supervise, right? And the net outcome is that your car is staying in the lane pretty well. But the process is not something that we can supervise to advantage. And that likewise, when the brain is dealing with its own internal mechanisms, as outside observers, we don't have a chance. So let the brain do what it's good at, and we just empower it, right? So that this is the essential revolution that traces all the way back to the practitioner that we learned from, namely, let the brain do it. Now she didn't have that, she very much thought that I'm in charge here, in her own mind. But the person was sitting there in the other room, not being attended to, right? No. The brain was doing it, and but that's the essential dichotomy in the neurofeedback field. We got so many people who said, "Okay, I'm in charge of this process," and they said, "Nah." So endogenous neuromodulation is actually happening with all those people also, right? Because the brain lunges on this information in ways they don't even appreciate. But they can still live under the illusion that they're in charge.
Got it. So what you said there was so fascinating. There's so many different pieces of it that I could go into, but just to reflect back what I'm hearing to make sure that I understand correctly. So when somebody is watching their live EEG during a neurofeedback session in this regard, what's happening in your mind is that the brain is able to auto-regulate more or less, right? It's picking up on its own signal like a mirror in close to real time where it's able to go, oh, that's me. This is something that I'm doing. Oh, I don't like that. I have a hair that I didn't shave correctly on my cheek, and so I'm going to go and shave that right now. I'm going to go clear that up. I'm going to correct myself to be more in alignment how I wish I actually was. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Uh, yes, but what I need to say is autoregulation is the brain's life, right? Nobody else is taking, right? It's got to take care of itself. Nobody else is doing it. Okay. So we're just refining the process, allowing the brain to refine the process of autoregulation by giving it this additional, very potent feedback path. And now the challenge is, in the normal brain, this is no big deal. Anybody can come and that doesn't have a lot of psychopathologies and so forth, have a great time, and maybe they get a slightly higher IQ out of it, and maybe they sleep better, a little better out of it. But there's not going to be very much drama, right? But when we're dealing with cases where the brain is more dysregulated, where more with severe psychopathologies, then there could be drama. And that's why the clinician needs to be absolutely in the loop.
Yeah, well, that was something you said earlier. You said, like, depending on the severity of, was it the trauma or the dysregulation that's going on, like, you might not want to show the brain all of the parts of itself immediately. And, again, you talked about the brain being in virtual reality. It just strikes me very much how that's even like a very informed, like, trauma response within, like, therapy, right? There's a sense of, like, hey, you might want to, like, not look at all of the dark parts of yourself immediately and the pains that you've gone through because you might not be able to handle all of that right away. And so you kind of want to take things in chunks. Is that a similar kind of thought process with the more dysregulated people?
We need to make a distinction here. The in this process, the traumas of the person are not at issue. That is the substance, the historical facts are not at issue. What is at issue is the physiological response to the trauma. And this is now the huge conundrum in mental health, right? That we are increasingly dealing with a traumatized population. We've been taken out of our natural environment as a species, and childhood trauma is now commonplace. It is the biggest looming issue in mental health, and it started to be recognized, but it's still under-recognized. And the thing is, a lot of this trauma is actually pre-verbal. And how does the body deal with that? Well, the trauma response can only be physiologically encoded because the memory function, recallable memory, that isn't there yet. So it's not available for recall. But the physiology remembers, right? The physiology has learned, and of course the trauma response is a case of one-shot learning. There only needs to be one, to alert the brain for the rest of life and alter its set point for the rest of life. And that makes it so problematic, and it also makes it hard to deal with because it's a natural response. Why should the brain give it up, right? The trauma was real after all. World is not safe. Life is not safe. I need to protect myself, right? Why should that wisdom that acquired early be given up? Why should the brain relinquish it? So this is a very tough nut. But that is the essential problem that we face, the most difficult problem we face in all of our work. The person who are profoundly traumatized early in their life, and they are not happy people. They're carrying a huge burden, and the world, of course, is not kind to them, and they're not kind to the world. So it goes both ways. This is a terrible affliction. And that is our core challenge. And that's when our life gets really dicey. Guiding those nervous systems to better function it calls upon our entire skill set. And yeah,
What are some of the key things that you bring to people like that when you see somebody who's gone through a tremendous amount of trauma at an early young age, and they're there because on some level they're showing up because they want to get better, right? But on some level their nervous system does not feel safe. They're everybody who maybe is trying to even help them or be kind to them, they can see as a threat, right? So like, how do you approach somebody like that and guide them safely through that process?
well, at that point, I have to say I'm not a clinician, right? I'm the scientist
Sure.
here.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't actually get to do this, but I get to watch it.
Okay.
So, uh, you know, actually, the relationship of the trauma-informed therapist and the client is hugely important here. There needs to be this relationship of trust. But what there doesn't have to be is a discussion of the traumas. We're just training the brain here, right? To, to a state where it can live tolerably, right? Under in better control, where you're not in the grip of the trauma response. Is the trauma response at some level still there? Of course. This is like a scar tissue or something. This is so deep. I don't think we ever, we don't erase it. We're not an eraser here, but we can shape that person's experience through the training to where the person then goes forward with more of a sense of safety, of not living under constant threat, and so forth. Right? We can change the physiological set points, and all of that can happen without discussing the traumas. We don't need to talk about the traumas. We don't need to talk about what happens. We don't have to argue whether your trauma is real or not. The physiology is dysregulated. That tells us you're living in the trauma response. We need no further information. We don't need the history. We don't need the recordings. We don't need the reports. The physiology is screaming at us that this person is living in a trauma response. And this is not quick, uh, but then there is the other part. There can also be with traumas that are remembered, the psychological aspect, right? And for that you do a different kind of program. It's still endogenous neuromodulation, but now we're in a different realm. Now we're in the realm of alpha and theta. It takes us to deeper states where our critical verbal faculties that tell us we'll never amount to anything, and have the adverse words of our parents, reverberating in our brain. No, all that goes silent, and we get to experience our core self, which is nonverbal. It gets to reveal itself through imagery. And so in this sort of quasi-dreamlike world, you may undertake a journey that leaves you afterwards profoundly altered, and you may not know why. But it was a healing journey in a very profound sense. And we have to turn it over to the brain. In this case, to the self that inhabits that brain, which when given space, when given the floor, when given the Klieg lights, will reveal itself, and that is always a wholesome experience, right? The encounter with the core self is always positive, is always wholesome, and that is then the ultimate rescue remedy for the deeply traumatized self, and that so there is the physiological aspect, and then there is the psychological aspect, but both are allowed to be the brain's journey. We're not micromanaging. We're not, subjecting the brain to to a close order drill here of yays and nays and left versus right and so forth. No, we turn the journey. we liberate the brain to uh, you know, undertake its own journey.
You said there that every time, forget the specific words, but every time you come into connection with yourself, it's a wholesome experience.
Well,
Um,
the core self, yeah. Um, we will have done the work of neuroregulation at this higher level, at this functional level where we engage with the outside world. Now we're dealing with that hard nut of the trauma at the core of self. It may be moral injury. It may be, recalling your dead colleagues on the battlefield, and missed opportunities to help, and your various shortcomings in those crisis situations, and so forth. And then the the experience then of your core self gives you a place to repair to. It gives you a refuge. That yes, the situation was problematic, but like I have my regrets about the things I could have done with my son, but I still need to have a basis for moving forward in life. I can't have that totally bottle me up. And so we need to liberate people in that sense, that they can move confidently forward in their lives. And that means giving them the experience with their wholesome core self. And that is the ultimate healing experience.
why, and I realize this is a tricky question, but why is the connection with with the core self always a wholesome experience? Why, what I hear when you talk about that, because I've been through a lot of neurofeedback and I've been through other experiences that have brought me into that connection with the whole self and that sort of revelatory oneness and forgiveness and other things that are really there. Why do you think that touch point with the core self is that wholeness, that sense of experience that you're talking about?
Words fail me here. I can
Hmm.
describe what happened without necessarily going to this other level and explaining it,
Sure. Yeah.
But there's an interesting aspect to this, which I think is where can be brought up here. So in the one sense, we're dealing with the greatest particularity, which is our core self, right? But it is in the nature of that, and we're very much tied up with that in the moment. But it's also in the nature of that experience that it's somewhat boundaryless, and and this feeling of finding yourself at peace with yourself also flows out into the world. It means being at peace with the larger universe, right? And so there's this intense particularity of the experience that is absolutely unique to you, and yet the context is one of boundaryless, sort of a global immersion in the larger universe, in which you now find yourself in a spirit of acceptance and so forth. So I think it can't be just about the self. It's got to be the self in relationship, and and I think the essence is that we're no longer talking about individual events. That's the we're at another level, right? We're suddenly in a different space where that radical individuality is experiencing itself in a boundaryless context, and I think that fusion, that boundaryless, boundarylessness, is probably the essence of the positivity that inevitably accompanies this this experience, this encounter with the core self.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if you were intentional about this, but what I heard in that, even when you say like the a specific particularity, if I said that correctly, right, is what I almost hear going back to the beginning of our conversation with quantum entanglement and like particles literally being in, like, if I think about the core self, well, that if there is a core self, and there's lots of different ways of people explaining this, how, like, the water that is in everything has been everywhere and is in all of us, and like all of this on that level, right? But like, that experience that people talk about with that experience of oneness, right? Like, and coming into contact with the self, and if that core self is in all of us and in all things, then it would also make sense that it is boundless, to your point, right? And it's we are almost in some ways like literally experiencing the entirety of everything, and moving into that place of acceptance that we are beyond simply our ego form and self, but we are also all of everything that's going on at the same time.
Yeah, and uh, our modern life really compels us to live uh, our life differently. Namely, we're living a life of engagement, and uh, contrast that with the life experience of people in eons ago, in the tribal communities and so forth, right? Uh, they we're now living very much under the constraints of a left brain consciousness,
Mm.
whereas uh, the earlier generations really lived much more in the right hemisphere consciousness. So now we have to create circumstances where the right hemisphere consciousness can surface in its universality, right? In its apprehension of the of the entirety. It's there. It's but it's so hard for it to reveal itself in the modern Western context, right? Uh, in the normal circumstances, we don't make the connection, and so uh, and that has meant that we have migrated more and more into kind of a divided brain kind of world, right? That is very, very costly. And it turns out that the the most impactful training that we do is very specifically oriented toward uh, improving the relationship, altering the relationship, normalizing the well, not not an inappropriate term, normalizing the relationship between the two hemispheres, bringing the the right hemisphere back into the level of control of our being that it rightly deserves, right? Uh, and so you can actually talk about this problem in brain terms, in this hemispheric divide. This hemispheric divide is the core divide in our right in our brains, and we need to our regulatory burden in the clinic is essentially largely focused on the right hemisphere. That is not talking to us, that is not revealing itself to us, but is actually the one that is more in charge of our human faculties.
Why do you think that is? Is that just a product of how society is structured, that we care so much more about what, like, left brain type activities or left hemisphere type activities, and we prioritize those skill sets and stuff, that ends up just kind of dominating within the brain? Or like, why do you think that is?
Our brains are being hijacked by our society, right? Into a pathological engagement, right? This is our brains are occupied territory. Uh, it's now being brought to our attention by a number of people that our our attention is being colonized, right? And once that happens, we lose the self, we lose ourselves. And now that's happening to our younger generation, and it is devastating, right? Because this works so well. Uh, got two grandchildren, and they're just drawn to these digital devices. It's just, it's magical. And as soon as their eyes are riveted on that panel, their attention is being recruited by forces way beyond their control. And uh, and that is where they begin to lose themselves, right? This is where they ought to be very much engaged at the human level with the people around them and other children. Uh, they're now glued to the devices. I just read an item. I think something like 40% of 4-year-olds already have access to a tablet. This is sheer lunacy. This is just absolute lunacy, and it's the wisdom of the Waldorf school that that this needs to be absolutely categorically resisted, because you know, they try to, give the child a much more natural upbringing with the mysteries, right? The fairy tales of our history and so forth. Where th- this this makes it enormously difficult for us to, our rescue remedy with neurofeedback should only be needed by a subset of people. But we're all now afflicted. This is we're not at home in this society. There's a much larger critique to be had here. We're a species in captivity. We're in captivity that we have ourselves created, right? We have willingly created this world in which we are the most ourselves the most captive, and and it's very hard for us to get out of this, right? It's now going to take something very deliberate at many levels. Now, neurofeedback may be the enabling therapy to allow people to see the world as it is, their own world as it is. But it's going to take societal change to recognize what we're doing to ourselves. So we're a species in captivity. Our waking brains are occupied territory, and yeah, we're living in essentially a modern plantation economy. So that's the larger scene. And as someone said, it's not enough to be well regulated in a pathological society. We have to address individual solutions are necessary but not adequate, right? We need to address problems at the societal level. The fact that we are now in such social division in this country is just a symptom of that. This is completely unnatural, and it's a consequence of our plantation economy, right? This is all being orchestrated. It is to be so divided in this country is not our natural state.
Yeah, when you say a modern plantation economy, what do you mean by that?
Okay. It is the United States version of a feudal economy, right? You're essentially locked into a world that gives you ever fewer choices to make, and this is now becoming very apparent to people. The multiplicity of ways in which they are constrained and choices to choices that they don't want to be making. And and so increasingly, we're in a society with under top-down control, right? That is pervasive, and humanity does not allow humanity to flourish as as it should.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of like what would it take to create a society or move us towards a society that would allow us to flourish and would allow us to regain some of those lost freedoms?
Uh, I the essence is we need to move back toward communalism, toward communal arrangements. Or we moved toward the nuclear family, and then the nuclear family fissioned, and
I've never heard it described that way, but that is hilarious.
yeah,
That is very spot on.
right.
I need
And
a physicist for that one, but yeah, that's great.
so so we're not in a good place, and yet we're still living in this illusion that we've made the choice to be this way. No. Uh, so, and I don't know how you get there with a society as it is structured, but the family, we're not in a friendly status. We're not in a child friendly status. This has to change. This has to change. We can't solve the problems just with neurofeedback, as wonderful as it is.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I agree with you. I'm really curious about this because this is something that, and I love that you called it communalism because it's something that I see like living in the Pacific Northwest and having friends in Portland and, having friends in multiple different communities. And a lot of people out here compared to when I was growing up in Southern California, there's a strong emphasis on community that I notice out here and how people operate. Not everywhere, not in every piece, but just in how they operate. Like I notice that there's a lot more effort with a lot of different people to, I want to say, intentionally not use Uber. Not because Uber is a bad service, but because one of the consequences that has come up of like capitalism that I think is really astute by my friend Matt mentioned this is that like we stop asking our friends for rides, right? And then the consequence of, well, I don't have to ask my friend for a ride because I can get an Uber really easily is now, well, I don't ride with my friend to the airport. And then we don't connect on the way to the airport. And then when he doesn't drop me off at the airport and I get back, I don't invite him over for dinner because he didn't take me to the airport. And so we don't have that dinner that we had and we don't build a deeper relationship. And so there's all of these like little layers of, on one hand, we get these benefits of this independent things, but then there's this long-term consequence we don't really see in the relationships that are formed and not missed when we don't do those things.
yeah, yeah. Right. And somehow, and this has to come from the bottom up, and that's not easy. But we're already in Southern California seeing people move out into smaller communities because they find out that they can make a living, their professional world can continue, while they themselves live in a more humane environment. But of course, the problem is nationwide. I just think we're seeing we may be seeing just the existing structure failing, and I think it really does have to fail. It's a grim thought at one level because this is going to be painful, and not looking forward to that. But it would not happen except under duress, right? We have to be forced to change, otherwise we sort of make do. And I mean, that was essentially also what happened to me when I got into aerospace. I mean, into neurofeedback. Aerospace was shrinking at that point. The Berlin Wall had come down. The Soviet Union had disintegrated, and there simply wasn't the sense of urgency anymore to be doing what I was doing. So, and then the military budget was shrinking, so there was a incentive to look for something else. And then my wife was already doing the neurofeedback training, so I basically just came aboard full time to do it from that time forward. But there was the kind of nudge, right? Uh, it was a push and a pull that got me into full time neurofeedback. And so it's going to take a push and a pull to get the macroeconomic change that we need. But we're clearly dealing in a very pathological world right now.
Yeah, well, and it makes sense too when you say, I actually really love, and I think it's a beautiful example of, the nuclear family and then, fission. And then in that state of fission, there's a ton of chaos, right? Which I think is part of the reality. There might be some order on like some deep level that's all, happening in some whatever, but like there's ultimately just all this chaos. We have to wait for that period of chaos to end before a new thing kind of emerges from that. And when you're talking about these constraints economically or whatever's going on, like if I can give you a positive lens or borrow my hopelessly optimistic, personality, there's parts of me that I see those constraints almost already happening in some ways, right? Where I see some of people that I know or friends that I know who are, not buying the second lawnmower, but are borrowing it from a friend, right? And we're starting to see some of these things, like to your point, from these constraints that are uncomfortable or whatever, but it's also leading to, I think, more people hopefully coming together. I see more people having dialogues that they weren't having 4 or 5 years ago. I see these conversations that people just were avoiding, that now they're willing to confront, because to your point, there's a little bit of external pressure to have them. But I don't know, I think something I deeply always have had faith in, and I think continue to have faith in, is in humanity functionally. And I think humans, we have a tendency to figure it out. And if there's one thing that we've done over and over again, it seems to be figure it out once we've, run into a wall. But we figure it out eventually, I think.
Uh, uh, yes. So in my little microcosm of the universe, uh, I see more people greeting each other on the sidewalk. Uh, so that's the beginning of a change, and it's generational. The older people tending to greet each other. The younger generation is still, not quite there. Uh, just my observation here locally,
Yeah,
and
well, and I wonder with COVID too, even just because I know when I lived in Seattle, it was like you just kind of kept social distance. That we had like a year of like practicing not saying hi, right? That's like almost conditioned into our nervous systems and things of that nature too. But yeah,
yeah. Uh, uh, but on the downside, I was just serving on the jury, and in the jury room, complete silence. Everybody, you know, on the bus down to the jury, to the courthouse, complete silence. The only people talking was a young girl talking to the mother. Right. Everybody else was silent. So we're still, and this is brought about by our communication media, right? Uh, and so it has actually disrupted the conversation that otherwise would occur most naturally, that you would engage with the person that you're going to spend the next 20 minutes with on the bus or train, and not happening, not happening.
yeah, no, I agree. It's something I notice where I notice it most prevalently in my own life is the gym. To be honest, like when I go to the gym, and this is not blaming anyone, but like I go with my headphones and I'm listening to my music or my podcasts, and I just notice how everyone in the gym is on their headphones as well and like in their own little world doing the thing. And I remember when I was younger and going to the gym, and gym was also a communal place, right? It was a place that you were lifting weights, you were doing your thing, but you were also, dapping somebody else up. You were learning from them. You were getting a spot here, and now it's all connected. That even when we're talking to each other, and it's like, oh, can I borrow these weights? I'm saying with my headphones on, he's saying his headphones, and we aren't like sometimes you don't even know what they're exactly asking, if they want to borrow the weights or if I'm still using them, and
Yeah,
so you
yeah,
say
yeah.
yes when you should be saying no. There's so much missed communication and connection because we're also in our own little world.
Yeah.
So
But you
yeah, it's a
see, in the
challenging
hot
place.
tub, nobody has their headphones on, but they still don't
This
talk
is
to
a
each
good
other.
point.
They still don't, right? Yeah. So
That's
no,
fair.
it's
That's fair.
we've reached a pathological extreme, and
Mm.
we need to rebound from that. The little revolution has to start one person at a time. Just get the conversation started, and so forth. Be the conversation starter in these settings, in the steam room and wherever. So so that's what needs to happen. But right now we're dealing with a pervasive pathology in our younger generation. What they're dealing with is they're not capable of mastering it. Right? We're seeing anxiety conditions that we've not seen before. We've seen a propensity towards suicide that we've never seen before. We have an enormous problem for which our work presents the potential remedy. Now, we, my challenge is now to move from the highly personal engagement at length over many sessions with the severely traumatized brain, nervous system, to where we deal with the broader reality of people who are not so severely afflicted, but could definitely significantly benefit. We have surely at least 30% of our student body who are in profound need of what we offer. Namely, their core deficit is a self-regulation deficit, and this is really the operative word, right? The brain self-management skills are deficient. That's the fundamental issue because they did not get a healthy start in early life, and the problem is this model does not have currency within the field of medicine. They're blind to this problem. The world self-regulation hardly exists is not in currency in the medical universe, and it's our core issue. And the problem is, of course, goes back to the way medicine was organized in the last century, in the 1920s, where it was put on a pedestal. This is something special. It only it calls for highly trained professionals, highly skilled, and then everything beneath that, where most of us live our lives, is sort of not medicine. It doesn't matter, right? It's not part of the conversation. And so we're led down the garden path by the MDs who live in this other universe of defined diseases, right, for which you have to meet threshold, whereas most of us are living, beneath that, and are adrift without the resources, and so it's very clear now that the core deficit in our society is a self-regulatory deficit. It accounts for the addiction, it accounts for the criminality, it accounts for the violence that we see, and out of control behavior in the school system. The whole ball of wax. It is, broadly speaking, a self-regulatory deficit. And in its extreme, you have the story of our son, Brian, right, where it was catastrophic seizure activity. But there's so much beneath that, where the brain is sort of not able to manage itself. And this is in the emotional domain, right? It turns out when you go back and look at the health trajectories, what happens to people over the course of life, the biggest factor that accounts for ill health and bad outcomes in the rest of life is the emotional upbringing of the child, in the first 2 years, first couple of years. And that is now compromised by the fact that in the modern world, the mother really cannot devote herself to the infant, as in prehistoric societies, right? And inevitably, the parent is going to be distracted by vicissitudes of life in these early years to an extent that actually matters to the neurological development of the child, to its detriment. So it's almost impossible now in the modern world to grow up as a child, to grow up healthy, and what used to be an environment that was universal, that infants grew up attended to categorically all the time, right? When the entire waking hours, they were being attended to by mother or other tribal members and so forth, right? And that's simply no longer the case. So, and it turns out that child abuse is one thing, and neglect is equally devastating, right? And whereas the nervous system can build defenses against abuse, it has no defense against neglect, right? It's just simply the absence of the loving and attentive and consistent mother. There's no way to defend, and the child still suffers. And this is now the core issue, right? It's sort of a stealth issue because we don't recognize it as the problem. It's just simply, the realities of life. But it's devastating to the infant because it launches fear, it launches a foundational insecurity, right? That it now carries forward, laying the basis for these anxiety conditions, early childhood, and then the insecurities may build to the point where the child even commits suicide. And these things have roots, and the roots take us all the way back to the early experience of the infant. And we're the only society, the only complex society that does not offer maternal leave. But it's not enough.
You mean by society? You mean by complex society? You mean the United States in particular?
Yeah, I mean
clarify on that.
the only societies that do not have paid maternal leave are traditional societies, right? Palau's, these are the Pacific Islands and so forth, where this is not an issue. This is where traditional family life is not in question. They don't have the problem. We have the problem, but now it's worse because I just saw some data on child health in Denmark just yesterday. And I figure, okay, Denmark has, maternal leave, but child health is just on a terrible, child ill health is on a terrible growth curve even there. So there's something beyond. It's not enough, it's a broader affliction, and I don't have the answer to that just now. But I just realized it's not just the flaw of not having parental leave, maternal leave and paternal leave. It is something else. Maybe the digital devices and so forth come into this, but the problems of moving to younger and younger years, and they're gender dependent. It turns out to be much greater affliction of our girls, and who, of course, are much more vulnerable to early traumas than the boys. But in the boys, it's more devastating. They become the criminals. Yeah. So, and here we come at it with an individual solution, right? The individual solution is marvelous. I mean, it is awesome, right? Because the potential for self-recovery in the human brain is just amazing. And we're just facilitating that. But we've got a much bigger issue, and you look at it and say, okay, that takes an entirely different level of remedy.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I really appreciate your perspective on it because I think that there are so many challenges with it, and I also appreciate like your humbleness. It's like, yeah, it's like on one hand, it's like it could be other thing, but then there seems to be something else going on, and it almost creates like another mystery in and of itself of like what is going on, why is this happening, and more importantly, what do we do about it? And it makes me think too about your son, um, and this idea of what happens when you put them in a better environment, right? An environment that allows them to be who they are and allows them to thrive in these different pieces. And I don't mean necessarily environment just like the outside or school, but the home environment for the parents, allowing the parents to thrive and feel comfortable and safe in who they are, and that allows them to raise a family that allows themselves to feel like they can be who they are, right? And it's this larger ripple effect. And I think one of the benefits of what you do and what so many others are doing with neurofeedback in various ways is that the gift, just like we learn through, I would say, a lot of Eastern wisdom or meditation, is that you can learn to be regulated, I want to say more or less independent of your circumstances, right? You can learn to hold that like higher, I don't know, level of consciousness, hold that like peace, inner peace, and that calmness, and develop that from within that allows you to penetrate whatever other things are doing to you, right? And you become sovereign in that way. And I think when you have more healthy, sovereign, regulated people, they start to create a more healthy, sovereign, regulated society, right? And start to build the infrastructure and the architecture physically, like literally, the types of buildings, the types of art, the types of TV shows, the types of media, right? Like even when I look at, us, like, there's this great irony of we're talking about technology and all these things, and here we are participating in that in that society and technology, and hopefully in a way that actually like contributes, right? And there's always that like weird thing where sometimes we only find out about bad things because of the thing that we created that let us know that there was a bad thing in the first place. Like there's so many weird conundrums like that, right? And there's also this great gift and opportunity with that to create healing on, I think, a large scale with all of these technologies and with the places that the world is going, that we can harness them in the correct way with the right people to create better individuals that create a better society.
Yeah, yeah. And we've seen we've seen positive developments that are in line with what you're saying. We worked in a group foster home in the early '90s here downtown LA, and there was the worst kid in the place actually recovered so well that he could go back home. He didn't need to live in the group home anymore.
Wow.
And then a couple of years later, he was back in the group home, and well, he did so well. Why is he back in the group home? Well, his mother went to prison on a drug charge, and he had no place to live. So this kid was still with that new skill set of resilience and so forth. Nevertheless, retained his ability to function even in that pathological world where his mother, a drug dealer and so forth, ended up in prisons. Right? He that resilience carried him, and so he wasn't back in the group foster home because he needed to be. No, he was very much in charge of himself. Right? He just didn't have another place to stay.
Yeah. Wow. What a gift.
Yeah. So yes, the individual solution is going to contribute to this, and then there needs to be the at the societal level a recognition, first of all, of the dilemma that we've created for ourselves, so that we can go for a remedy.
Yeah. I have one last question I want to ask, and then I'll ask my final question because I know we're running out of time here. And the one question I wanted to circle back to, and it was something that you said where that we are experiencing, or that people have more childhood trauma than they did previously, or that just that like childhood trauma is a greater issue than it ever was previously. When you say that and you look back at even when you were a kid or other people were a kid, do you feel like there is actually more trauma now, or do you feel like we are simply maybe aware of said trauma now? And I'm always curious about that distinction, you know?
There is more trauma now because the parents are not capable of, more parents are not capable of being good parents, right? Because they have their own set of difficulties. So we're dealing with multi-generational trauma. But the bigger issue is this stealth issue of neglect, right? Which, because it's not just neutral terrain. To get a functioning human being out of this process, the infant has to be unconditionally loved, right? It has to be a positive experience. It can't just be neutral. Neutral is not enough. No, this infant needs to know that it is the beneficiary of unconstrained, unbounded love from the mother or the mother figure, and and so there, and if that is sort of, you know, not happening and not happening with continuity, right? If it's episodic or something, not good enough. No, so there's this very high bar on what needs to happen to launch a functioning human being.
I mean, I love that, and I love what you said. Yeah, I will say that because I know we got to wrap it up. So again, Sigurd, this has been amazing. The one question I always ask all of my guests at the end of the episode is simply, what's one question that you would have for the audience? What's one question that might shift their perspective or have them think about something in a different way?
Well, of course, I'm wildly curious about how this is going over with your audience. I think it's hard for me to think of a question, but I think the question that I'd like to have them focus on is where this has moved their minds on this issue of feeling responsible for who they are, because the liberating experience of our son was once he did the neurofeedback. Well, first of all, with the meds, it says, okay, it's not me, it's my brain. That fundamental transition, that liberating transition took place as soon as he was on meds and realized he was benefiting. The next revolution was with the neurofeedback, where he then said, here's something I can do for myself, right? Because until that happened, everything was just an imposition on him, and he felt constrained by it. I have to take my meds. I'm not functioning well with my meds, but I have to take my meds, and so forth. This then became liberating. Okay, here's something that changed his life, right? Here's something I can do for myself. Okay. And I think this conversation should change how people see themselves in terms of easing the burden on themselves. Okay, this is that part. That's my brain. That I know how I got here, and that means we take a different level of responsibility for it. We're not. It shifts from a moral burden that to one of, okay, here's an action item. I could do something about that, right? And so this conversation should be seen as liberating for people in that sense, in the same sense that it was for our son. That first of all, it's not me, it's my brain, and secondly, here's something I can. Here's something that I can do to remedy that aspect. So I'm back in charge. and not simply the victim of, you know, whatever.
Yeah, beautiful. That was very, very well put. The analogy definitely landed with me. Again, Siegfried, thank you again for coming on the show. If people want to find out more about you or you want to point them anywhere, where would you like to send them?
Well, okay, eeginfo.com. Kurt Othmer has a YouTube channel. I don't actually know how to get there. Um, but eeginstitute.com. Our literature is for professionals listening. Our literature is on ResearchGate, to be found on ResearchGate, and we welcome professionals to our professional training courses, and of course, we would love to see clients come visit our professional network. We're in Los Angeles here in Woodland Hills, and would love to see people. We turn lives around we can turn lives around very rapidly with in the course of 20 to 40 sessions.
Well, wonderful. Siegfried, again, this has been lovely. Thanks again for coming on the show, and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity. It's
My pleasure.
I had no idea this is this is going to unfold in this way, but it's been
Yeah.
uh, you know, you've forced me into
I hope I didn't force you too hard, but yeah.
no. I went willingly, but indeed it was very different from what I thought would unfold. But it's been great.
Beautiful. Well, I appreciate the time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.